Yes.
Okay. All right, here we go. All right, so just to give you a little background information, and if you haven't been joining with us the whole month of March, that's okay. We have all of the past videos and resources available for you to go back and view, because in February, we have completely focused on fruit. So we started out the month with a little satire, so you want to grow fruit, and that was just a 30-minute intro to kind of get your mind engaged, get to thinking about some of these fruit crops, and we've kind of worked through some backyard berries and then some of our cool fruits, and tonight is just the culmination of getting specific crop questions answered. And all of these materials were developed by our state home fruit and vegetable work group. So many of the agents across the state are going to have access to these, and we all do it a little bit different, but like I say, I've kind of massaged it based on what y'all wanted to talk about. So when we think about fruit production, we do want to think about many things, because fruit is not going to be like our vegetables and even some of our landscapes, depending on what we're going for there, because fruit production is going to take us a lot of time. We've got to spend a little time planning. We've got to think about plant management long term. It's not one of those things that we can solve pretty quickly. It's something we've actually kind of got to be in advance of and thinking ahead of all the time. We have to think about when those harvest intervals are, especially if we're producing multiple crops, because sometimes that can interfere with some of our other activities and even some of our personal and professional life. So always got to be asking those questions. So some of the things we like to ask is just what your personal philosophy is on management. We all have a different management style when it comes to gardening, no matter what that is, but that's especially going to be really pertinent when we talk about fruit. So some of the things we want to focus on in the next few slides are the 5 S's, and you see those listed there. So whether you're growing fruit now or you're just getting started, think about all of these: the sun, slope, soil, space, and sweat. And again, just knowing what your style is, you've got to think about the time that you're willing to sacrifice in some cases to spraying, what materials you're wanting to use. If you are practicing organic, that might be an issue, especially with some of our fruit trees. Site management, we don't want to be planting an orchard or a vineyard where we're getting shade the majority of the day. We have to think about pruning and training. It's going to be a little bit variable depending on those crops. And then wildlife management. Some of you are going to have a lot more pressure than some of the rest of us. I know some of you here in Northeast Tennessee that are living along the National Forest or even within the Great Smoky Mountains. When you border that, you're going to have a little bit more issue with some of those wildlife critters. And then again, just thinking about harvest time. I like this picture because it takes us back a few years, and of course this is not how we manage spraying fruit trees today, but it's a little bit of a comedy relief, I guess, because this is just not what's going to cut fruit production and management anymore. Also, some other things to think about. Fruit used to be a pretty easy crop to grow, especially blueberries and even some of the old-timey pear trees, because we used to say you didn't have to use a lot of chemicals on those. But now we've got some pest control or pest issues that have started to emerge, and we've seen those with a lot of our hardwoods in our forest, with the woolly adelgid and the pine beetle and some of those things. But when it comes to fruit, the spotted wing Drosophila fly has really become a major issue. And where we used to not have some pressure, we've started to see more occurrences of this in the last few years. So we need to kind of think about these things too as we're planning for fruit production. Think about your site, because we do need that 8 to 10 hours of sunlight. We want that early morning sun where it's going to come in and dry off the dew, the fog, the rain, from the night before. And you can kind of see from the picture here, this vineyard's going to get quite a bit of shade throughout the day, and that's going to lend itself to a higher occurrence of any of fungal pathogens, any of those disease pathogens. Because even with all those trees around, we might think that all that airflow is going to be good within that canopy, but actually it's going to make that wind a little bit stagnant just in that area. So really think about your sun, and along with that is our slope. One of the biggest issues is just being cognizant of the fact some of these fruit crops are going to need to be trellised. So if we're on an uneven slope, it might be a little bit tougher for us to trellis some of those systems. Also think about your soil, because this is we're gonna run the gamut when we talk about some of these fruit crops, from blueberries requiring a really low pH to brambles kind of hitting in the middle, you know, up to our grapes and apple trees requiring a little bit higher pH. So we want to make sure that we're planting the right crop in the right place. And I kind of already alluded to that with the soil, but another thing is just being able to manage fertility, knowing that we've got good water drainage. And from this picture, you can kind of see a pro and a con. Number one, we know that it's going to hold water, but you can kind of see how this has been raised up on beds. So for a backyard grower, this is probably not always going to be very feasible to do. But if you've got a site in your garden that you're wanting to plant fruit and you have water standing like this, that's not going to be good, especially for blueberries. So take some of those things into consideration before planting, because it's always better to be proactive than reactive. Now, I'm not going to go through all this mumbo jumbo because you're going to get this in a few publications and within the slide set, but just think about your space. Space can really determine what you can truly grow. And not all of us are going to have the area or the space to grow fruit trees. You know, some of us may actually have a fence row where we can plant brambles and get away with that. Some of our soil sites are not going to be adequate. Even if we're wanting to plant blueberries, I mean, it's going to take a little while to get that soil amended to where we can plant. So always be thinking about spacing. Apple trees obviously are going to require more space than caneberries or strawberries. So just kind of keep some of those in mind. We also talk about pollination requirements, and you should have received a couple of resources on that this month. If not, again, when you log into the website, you'll see all that there, but really pay attention to some of our cultivars and our different species and the pollination requirements. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these cultivars because I've got those listed out. That would just take an enormous amount of time. But as you're planning this out, and if you need help on that, don't hesitate to reach out, because we want you to be successful from the beginning. So one thing I want to caution with this slide is just to recognize that even when we have self-fertile varieties, I always recommend a couple of different varieties just to be on the safe side. Always planting more than one just so we can ensure adequate pollination. Our last S, of course, would be sweat and time. We've really got to think about that right out of the gate. Be cognizant of the fact, mechanization, you can kind of see from this picture, this is something that's not going to happen for us in a backyard setting. And just being aware that fruit's going to be a long-term investment. We're not working that from year to year. And even in our landscape, we've kind of joked in some of our other classes that we move things around and we change things up. It's like rearranging furniture in our house. And we can do that and be okay. A lot of those plants are going to be forgiving, but fruit crops are going to be less forgiving in that instance. So just recognizing planning up front is really going to save you hardship in the long run. Another thing is to just think about if you're wanting to create that edible landscape, and we're going to talk more about that later in the year, but just keep that in mind too as you're planning, because you can see here some of those crops are going to overlap. Sometimes you're going to have a little bit of a space interval there where you can actually grow your garden and be, canning tomatoes and that kind of thing, like the strawberries. So think about what is really going to work for your setting. And I really like this slide just because it kind of shows that fruit crops are really a 13-month-a-year crop. We used to say that about burley tobacco. There wasn't enough time in a year to get a full crop out. And it's often the same way with fruit. You've always got to be thinking. So right now we're at the end of February, and you can kind of see down here in January into February is when we need to be applying that dormant oil. And that is so crucial, and that's so essential to preventing a lot of problems down the road. So I'm going to touch on this more as we move through tonight, but just to kind of set the framework, we've got to think about preventing disease and insects now, Because when we start seeing those issues manifest themselves throughout the growing season, we're often too late to be able to control either one of those very effectively. So basically what we're doing now when we're applying that dormant oil and we're doing some pruning, we're actually enhancing the life of that tree. We're invigorating that tree. It's going to give it its best shot, you know, in just a few more weeks as springtime emerges. You know, that dormant oil is smothering out some of those bad insects that have overwintered. You know, we're pruning, we're shaping up that tree. We're going to get good growth on that tree. So those are some of those practices that we have to focus on this time of year, but we often, and guilty here myself, we often don't think about them until it's too late to do anything. So just think about that too. Print that out and hang it on your fridge so you'll always kind of know. Everybody wants to know when they're talking about growing fruit, when can I harvest? And this is where I literally get fruit thrown at me because, you know, and again, I'm guilty of this, so I'm preaching to myself here. I can't expect to plant a couple of grapevines and think I'm going to be producing wine this fall. Or even next year, or, you know, even blueberries. I mean, blueberries, as far as up front, that's going to take an enormous amount of time. You know, we've got to think about pushing the effort of that blueberry bush into the root system for the first 3 years. So it really, really is hard on us to go out there and pinch off the blooms or the berries those first couple of years, because we don't want that bush to produce fruit. We want it to focus on settling in to where it'll be productive for years to come. So just kind of look at this and you can kind of see where we're at from planting to the first harvest. That's why a lot of folks like the strawberries and even the caneberries, because they're going to give us a quick bang for our buck. And again, and I say this just to reiterate, match your fruit with your lifestyle, because again, when we grow those summer gardens, you know, it's maybe right now, you know, mid-March to September endeavor, and we've got time intervals in between that we're not always having to be in the garden. You know, we can leave it for a little while. Fruit oftentimes is going to take a little bit more time to deal with, so just know that up front. So just distilling all of this down, because that's quite a bit of information, and how do we kind of quantify that and move forward. And again, I think just one of the important components about thinking about growing fruit is, number one, that it can be done, but just understanding it's going to take a little bit more time, energy, and effort management on your part, a little bit more sweat involved with that. So this is kind of where our fruit and veggie team, we kind of got to thinking about how do we make this relatable to y'all as backyard growers, and we kind of tiered it down into 3 levels: tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So if you're a grower right now that is producing fruit, we're going to use tonight more as a refresher course, if you will, because these tier 1 growers, they've kind of already answered a lot of those questions that we've just gone through, and we call them doing what it takes. They're very picky, almost obsessive compulsive about their fruit production. You notice there that they're an artist with the pruners. This is something, you know, it's a science and an art to them. They can vision out beyond a year or two and actually see where that tree or that bush is going to be in a couple of years. They're going to increase their input costs with netting or any kind of trellising system. This is going to be somebody that's going to want to be at home. They're not going to be on the road all the time. You know, those that know me before pandemic, I was gone all the time. I really don't even know how I did a garden every year, but like, I know for me, fruit production is totally out of the question, except for those cool fruits. I'm going to get into some of that, y'all. But you know, when we're a tier 1 grower, we can grow some of those more labor intensive crops like the trees, and think about grapes, especially for anything that we're growing in a vineyard or orchard type setting is going to be one of these tier 1 growers. It's going to take a little bit more time to commit to that crop. So again, taking the most time in pruning and pest and management. They're going to require the most space. Soil's going to be more of an issue, and then wildlife. You know, a lot of our wildlife species and birds especially are going to appreciate that fresh fruit just as much as we do. So we've got to really consider that too. So our next level is our tier 2 growers, and these are the ones that would say, well, you know, I do okay. I've got a pretty reasonable site. I can accommodate some of these fruit crops. I've got a set of pruners. I'm pretty handy with them. I know what I'm doing. And, you know, I even have an arsenal of spray, so I can actually accomplish some of this and maybe even invest. You know, I've got some old tomato stakes or fence posts that I can use to trellis. And, you know, I go to work and I come home, you know, so this is going to be our tier 2 growers. And we've discovered that a lot of our backyard growers, this is where we're falling. So you can see there, a lot of our berry crops that we talked about last week are going to fall into this category. They're a little bit easier to manage long term. And you see there, blueberries, caneberries, they're going to be productive without having to spray 12 months a year or do any kind of reasonable effort management practice each month of the year. We do have those disease-resistant cultivars, and you see there, I put that in big bold letters. We need to use those. So that's going to be a huge component of your fruit, making sure that you get a cultivar that's going to be suited. You've already heard me talk about that. That's going to be really important. Irrigation may or may not fit in to this system, but you know, this is our tier 2 growers may have the capability to do some kind of drip irrigation just when they're away for a short period of time. And then we have our tier 3 growers, and this is me. I love fruit. I just have not had the time to be able to do much with it, but you know, I just don't kid myself about it because you know, I don't have time. That's my biggest constraint. But maybe space is going to be one of those issues. Sometimes you can't find pruners, or do you even own pruners? Do you even think that's necessary? And I've been on several calls. Lee and I were chatting before the class tonight, and he said he had been on some site visits today. You know, I've been on some site visits myself where, you know, it's been the fruit's being neglected, and it's a lot harder to revive that fruit and get it productive. It takes a couple of years to be able to do that. So again, that's just a practice we've got to be utilizing. And then you notice they're having a deck that can double as a trellis. Again, we've got a lot of resistance that are going to be built into some of these cultivars, so really research those. If there's nothing else you really take away from tonight, if you've not planted fruit, that's what I really want you to focus on, because it can save you so much time and money in the long run. And one of the other reasons for the tier 3 growers is just a shorter time to that fruit production, which is a big plus. Again, we plant the strawberries and we get to reap the benefits that year. So the best of offense is a good defense. We hear that a lot of times. We were all on here just a few minutes ago talking about the weather, the climatic challenges and the shift in our regions. You know, oftentimes the month of the year or certain things that we would see blooming would serve as indicators for things we needed to be doing in the garden. Kind of falling back to our Farmer's Almanac class a few weeks ago. But these climatic challenges, it's really starting to shift, and we're seeing more and more of that. It's hard to predict what Mother Nature is going to throw at us. You know, heat and humidity, depending on where you're at. You've often heard me say in some of our plant pathology classes, our disease classes, that a lot of these, we're going to talk about these in a few minutes, a lot of these diseases are going to move with water. And water's not just that rain falling from the sky. That's going to be high humidity. That can be dew. That can be heavy fogs, you know, and that is all prevalent in many of the regions that we're joining from tonight. We get the question a lot, do I really need to spray all that? And again, just remember that pests and disease like to eat fruit just like we do. So those cultural practices are going to be really important right out of the gate. Again, disease resistance, site selection, very simple, and then pruning. So if we just get used to doing these things all the time, then it becomes second nature. It becomes a habit for us. One thing that's in your Google Drive, it's on the website, you should have gotten an email with this link, is our publication 1622. And that's our disease and insect control in home fruit plantings. I call this my fruit Bible. It goes with me everywhere. I have a copy of it in my car and everything, but it's a real short publication, but it's crop specific. So if you're growing apples, it's going to tell you that spray schedule and for what disease or insect just for apples or grapes or whatever crop you're growing. So it's really handy to just have this on tap, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. So again, just asking that question, does fruit really suit your lifestyle? Thinking about those 5 S's, think about your personal management philosophy, and just, you know, some people will say I'm stingy with my money, you know, but I don't want to invest a lot of money up front and then, you know, be traveling all the time or not doing some of these cultural practices up front and having a failure as a crop just because it wasn't really suited for me. So what we're going to do now is get into some more of the questions y'all have asked in the Google form. Just give a really brief overview of some of these because you should have gotten the blueberries and strawberries last week. So those are each an hour long. So if those are 2 crops you want to grow, make sure you go back and visit those for a lot of more in-depth details. But just a few things to hit on. Just remember about blueberries. We've got a couple of different species that we grow, the rabbit eye and the northern high bush. Actually, let me flip to that one. So our rabbit eye, it's our tallest and our longest living. Later to ripen, it's going to be more tolerant of heat and drought. So typically when people call here for Northeast Tennessee, I know that rabbit eyes are going to produce well. We've seen that pretty consistently. So we'll typically recommend rabbit eyes. It's not to say that our other varieties can't grow well. It's just that here in Greene and Washington County, we know that the rabbit eye performs well. The northern high bush, that's going to be one that requires a little bit higher chilling hour. And remember that term, we're going to come to that in just a few minutes, but that means it's a little bit more cold tolerant, but you're going to have more disease pressure with that. So if you're joining us from like Carter County or up in Johnson County in Northeast Tennessee, those in southeastern Kentucky, northern high bush are going to perform a little bit better there than the rabbit eye. And then southern high bush, that's a hybrid. It was bred for low chill, but we've not had a lot of testing on this. So we've actually got these in trials across the state. We've actually got a site here in Greenville that we're growing all 3 of these. And so we'll have a little bit more information on that for you in a couple of years as far as data sets. But just remember this term chilling hour, because you'll notice there if we do purchase a southern high bush, we want to choose a cultivar with a higher chill hour. And pretty well already went into these, but you'll have these to kind of refer back to. The other thing on the high bush is that they are a little bit pickier on site, and pH is going to be a little bit pickier on there. Okay, I'm going to skip through that one. All right, so what are these chilling hours, and are they necessary? What crops do we need to be worried about chilling hours, and why? Why is this such a big issue? Well, before a plant can break dormancy, it's got to accumulate a number of these hours, and those temperatures have to be between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And we often know, again, Mother Nature can throw us for a loop, and sometimes that gets a little mixed up. The signals get a little mixed up, but sometimes those chilling hours are going to be really important, especially for apple and blueberry crops. If your chilling hours are too low, then that plant is going to break dormancy too fast, and it can suffer from frost damage in the springtime. If we purchase a cultivar that the chilling hours are too high, then that plant's going to break dormancy too late, and it's going to leaf out really poorly, and it's just going to be a stressed plant throughout the season, and it's going to lack the vigor. So when we talk about chilling hours, I'm not going to give you that tonight. There's a link on this slide that you can actually go in and punch your zip code in, and it will tell you what chilling hours are required, because even here in Northeast Tennessee, that can vary a little bit from crop to crop. So when we do talk about fruit and nut trees, those are going to require a little bit higher chilling hour than some of our blueberry crops. So just keep in mind that this is something that's a pretty big deal. You see here for our high bush blueberries, we need higher than 800 chilling hours. Southern high bush and rabbit eye have lower chilling hours. So we want to be hitting this map just right. Like I say, I've got a link in there that'll direct you, so it'll be a little bit easier for you to read it that way when you plug in your zip code. Blackberry cultivars are going to have lower chilling hours. You can see there even down to 300. But again, you know, when you're purchasing these, just make sure that you ask about those chilling hours, that you know what those chilling hours are, because that can actually lead to success or failure of your endeavor. So just be really careful with that. Now, as far as blueberry diseases, a couple that I want to talk about, mummyberry and Phomopsis twig blight, but also is your pH. And, you know, I know that Big Spring Master Gardeners that are on here right now probably going to cringe when I tell this story, and I tell it all the time. So if you've heard it, I apologize. But, you know, when we went in a couple of years ago to plant this blueberry trial at the research center, we basically had like a week turnaround time from the time that we knew we got the grant. We purchased the plants, had to plow the field, get the amendments on, and all that good stuff. And if you recall, 2 years ago, that was when it was super wet. So like super mucky wet. Well, we just didn't do it right. And that was, you know, I mean, we knew we were going to try to be chasing time and making up for some of those issues. But the biggest issue was pH. The pH had traditionally been hay ground, limed every year. So that pH was sitting at about a 6.8 to a 7. Blueberries need that 4.5 to 5.2. Well, it takes a lot of sulfur and truthfully a lot of time to bring that soil pH down to where it needs to be. So I just share that story to say if blueberries are something you want to grow, be patient. Get your soil amended first. Add that organic matter to the soil. Get it fluffy. I call it the fluff. It just helps, you know, again, blueberries roots don't have those root hairs, so they're going to be more sensitive to some soil issues than our other fruit crops. But just make sure you get that pH down where it needs to be, because if not, your plants are going to tell you. You're always going to be trying to chase them. You're never going to be able to really get them caught up. So this is actually an iron deficiency. So when those pH levels are not low enough, it's just the soil chemistry. We tie up issues and we can get deficiencies or toxicities depending on the plant. So this is what we encounter when that pH is too high. This is another one that you may encounter with blueberries. And don't worry, the control issues, we're going to talk about all those a little bit later because we're going to use some of the same chemicals, but I want you to have some pictures so you can kind of acquaint yourself with this. But again, treatment measures are all going to be in that handy guide that I've sent out to you this morning. So this is what mummyberry looks like, and you can kind of see what that material looks like. It's kind of ghosted, and you can see some of the striations here in the leaf. And again, just to caution you, I didn't really put a slide in here, but this just jogged my memory. Oftentimes when we see some of these physiological type issues going on with the plant, folks will think that's disease or vice versa. So make sure that you submit a sample or send a picture to your local extension office, send it to me, whatever. Let us look at it, because if you think this is disease and you start applying a fungicide, what are you doing? That plant doesn't need a fungicide, so that's just money, time, and effort and energy, you know, that you've spent when you didn't need that. It's really a pH problem, and that can go both ways. So just keep that in the back of your mind. If you get something kind of funky going on, send us a picture and let us identify it. That's why we have the Ask Us team. Jenny's a member of that. That's why we're all here to help you get solutions to those problems. And then this is what the Phomopsis twig blight looks like. It just looks like it's dying back. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just some cultural things that we can do. When we see that plant litter or any of that debris, remember that that's harboring inoculum. Okay, so those fungal spores are there and they're overwintering, and they're just going to continue to be there and manifest themselves and be an ongoing issue. So rake that stuff out of there, prune out any of that diseased or dead material, and burn that stuff. And you see, I'm on every one of these slides, I'm going to refer us back to this 1622, and we're going to look at that in a few minutes. All right, so moving on from blueberries to strawberries, and again, I'm going through these really quickly, but just knowing that you've got a few options for your strawberry production. We've got short day, everbearing, and then the day neutral type strawberries. The biggie on those is just knowing that you've got to have good drainage. Soil pH needs to be in that 6 to 6.5 range. One thing I would caution you is if you're planting these in a raised bed, in the garden, in a high tunnel, whatever, don't follow some of your solanaceous crops like tomatoes, because verticillium wilt, some of those, if you're not buying resistant cultivars, some of those soil-borne pathogens can pose an issue. So make sure that you look into that before you purchase these. But again, just kind of a reminder, those short day are what we call the June bears. This is what a lot of our commercial growers will grow, the big strawberries, the sweet charlies, the camarosas. And you see those often along the river, the Nolichucky River. If you're here in Northeast Tennessee, you'll see a lot of those on plastic this time of year. The everbearing, this is grown really popular with our home gardeners. These are what we call those long day. They're going to be late spring and producing in the early summer or late summer, early fall crop. You're not going to have a lot of runners with these, and I'm going to show you a picture of the two here in just a minute, but they don't have a lot of daughter plants, but they're going to have multiple crowns. Actually, let's see here. So yeah, that matted row culture, and some home gardeners don't like this because you can see why it's called a matted row. It kind of forms this matted carpet. You have to have some row space in between there initially, but you can kind of see how those daughter plants, all those runners, are starting to form together, and they form that huge mat. Years to bearing is about 1.5 years. Expected life of the planting is going to be 3 to 4 years. I have seen some of these matted row systems actually produce up to 7 years, but that requires a lot of management in regards to renovation, which is basically the same as pruning in apples. We're renovating those strawberries each year. And here again, just another picture to kind of show what that looks like. The soil is going to be exposed around there, and that's just going to enable those runners to take hold and continue growing. And then we have the hill or plasticulture system. Often this is what we're going to plant, use the plugs to plant, or those greenhouse runner tips. Again, this is what you're going to see in commercial production, but we do have some home gardeners that are starting to invest a little bit more money into some of these systems. So you can kind of see what that looks like there. And of course, everybody loves strawberries and blueberries. They're coming this way too for container gardening. There's actually some cultivars for blueberries. I didn't put that in on a slide, but blueberries and strawberries we can grow in a limited amount of space. You can grow strawberries in gutter systems. You can pretty much grow strawberries anywhere. So it's really cool to get those growing. Let's see, we'll talk about some of these diseases. And again, Phomopsis, you can see what that looks like there. You can see these concentric rings, but again, always send these in just to make sure we're getting the right diagnosis. And especially with the next three, I mean, we're going to treat these the same, but if we have an idea if some of these issues are going on, we share that information with other home gardeners, so everybody can kind of be on the lookout for some of these. But this is actually anthracnose, and you can see how it makes that fruit soft. But this one here also does that, the leather rot or the crown rot. And of course, that's not going to be viable fruit, so this is something we're going to want to control. And then this is what we refer to as botrytis, and we see a lot of this in Northeast Tennessee, and that's usually just because of the high humidity that we have here. But all of these we would treat pretty much the same way. And then we have the red steel disease. We don't see a high occurrence of this like we used to because we do have so many resistant cultivars, but you can kind of see how these plants are just not performing. And there again, sometimes we're not going to see leaf spots and things like that. Sometimes we're going to have more of a stem right at the soil line, or even a root issue. So we've always got to be kind of plant PIs and investigating the root cause to be able to discern what's really going on, to be able to treat it. So again, we're going to go back to that 1622, our fruit Bible. It's going to depend on what pathogens are present as to what we're going to spray. But as long as we're managing good row and plant space, and we've got good sunlight penetration and airflow, that's going to help a lot with disease pressure. Control your weeds within those rows. Anytime we've got weeds, of course, that is creating a barrier. No airflow can get in there, and it's just keeping things moist all the time. Okay, so from strawberries, we'll go into a little bit on caneberries. We want to think about ripening time on these because it can vary pretty widely. You can actually be harvesting caneberries all season long if you're growing each type of these. So raspberries and blackberries, we call these brambles as well. You'll hear that used. I've asked Dr. Lockwood on this a couple of times. Brambles are typically associated with being thorny, whereas caneberries, with a lot of these new cultivars, especially coming out of Arkansas, they're thornless. So that's why we're starting to use more of the caneberry terminology. But if you hear those, oftentimes we'll use those, and they mean the same thing, but just be aware of those differences. Raspberries and blackberries are going to do quite well in Northeast Tennessee. Blackberries tend to do maybe a little bit better for our area up here. But if you like the red, black, and purple and the yellow fruited, got a lot of different options there that can give you flavor throughout the season. You can see there the red raspberry versus the blackberry. Both very healthful too. But again, you can kind of see what we're looking at here when we talk about primocanes and floricanes, because I've given you some pruning diagrams. They're one-pagers, so they should be really effective in helping you be able to prune your caneberries. But you can kind of see that primocane year, we're not going to be fruiting. That's your fruit bud initiation, and then we move into the second year, and that's what we call that floricane, and then that cane dies back and doesn't yield any more fruit. So if you're looking to get into caneberries, this is one I probably need to do a hour-long class on, because we just don't have enough time to get into all this. But I've tried to pack a lot of information in here so you can kind of see what those differences are. But again, if you are considering this, don't hesitate to reach out, and we can talk about your situation and kind of go from there. Just a few diseases to make mention of. This is going to be that orange rust, a fungal organism. You can spot that a mile away, that bright orange, those bright orange spore cases on the back side there. And then this is anthracnose. So this is going to be one of the same pathogens that's causing anthracnose in some of our other fruit crops. Anthracnose is going to be everywhere. It can be everywhere on that fruit crop, so even on the stem too. Leaf spot, this is pretty prevalent, and again, weather driven. So it's something you're just going to see probably a lot of this in high humid areas. If you are planting some of the, what I call the tame cultivars, wild brambles within a couple of 100 yards are not going to be cool. They can actually increase some of these disease occurrences. So you may want to consider removing those. Don't have those anywhere nearby. And again, just making sure we're managing the weeds. We want good airflow. And then if you do have diseased canes, especially with the rust that I showed you, prune those out, even if it's during the season, and burn that and get rid of those spores, because that's what we want to manage, is that disease. So as we move into grapes, those that know me know that that's probably my favorite fruit for multiple reasons. But when we think about a vineyard, that's going to be one that's going to be more labor intensive. Well, right up there with some of our fruit trees, depending on how you go. So again, this is one we could devote a lot of time to, but the big difference is just recognizing the difference between our wine grapes and our table grapes. Wine grapes, the Vitis vinifera, some of those common wine grapes from the old world, like Chardonnay, Cabernet, Zinfandels, Merlots, Sauvignon Blanc, all of those, they're not going to grow very well here. Riesling, that's another one. Not to say that they won't, but they are going to be very, very picky. So this is when you really want to consult with someone, get in touch with your extension folks on that if you're thinking about growing a large vineyard, just to make sure that it's going to be well suited for that. We can get away with some of those French American hybrids, which we have a lot of that in production in Northeast Tennessee. But we have a lot of the table grapes. So think about any of those Concord grapes, any of those jelly making grapes, those are going to do quite well, as well as our muscadines. And muscadines are going to kind of depend on where you're at. This is our native grape, so we don't have a lot of disease pressure, which is really good. But notice there at that second bullet point that it's only grown in warmer parts of Tennessee because of that winter hardiness issue. We've seen vines here be killed out because of weather, but we've also seen very successful vines here. It's a lot of that's going to be weather related. But if you like the traditional foxy native grape, then muscadines or the scuppernongs are going to be a great addition to your edible landscape. One reason we say that they do require a lot of time, you can kind of see there, just like blueberries, we want to get that soil ready, that site development, that site established before we buy the first vine. And it is going to require an enormous amount of time as far as trellising and training. You can kind of see from that picture here, it's almost an artwork. We have multiple trellising systems that we can incorporate, which are all going to be dependent on which type you're growing. The Vitis vinifera versus the French American hybrid versus our table grapes and muscadine. So there's lots of different, or a lot of variability with grapes, but a couple of the publications, if you're interested in growing grapes, make sure you read both of those from UT. And then there's also one that I included from Georgia that has a lot of information, just kind of getting you started. As far as diseases, and these are ones y'all have asked about or ones that we see every year. This is black rot, very, very prevalent. This is usually how you're going to see it start manifesting itself. And I wish that I didn't have that writing right there, because you would be able to see some lesions behind here on the stem. So that's another way that we know too that it's black rot. So, and again, on the fruit, you're going to see what this looks like. Don't leave that. You hear me say that all the time, but any of these fungal pathogens, get that out of there, because it's just going to keep producing more and more spores and causing not only you problems, but maybe your neighbor down the road that has grapes growing on the fence row or whatever. So this is one that's just easily controlled by cultural methods. And you can kind of see that explanation there, or picture, it shows you that white dot a little bit better. But eventually what's going to happen, you can kind of see that happening here, that just shrivels up and dies completely back. Then another one we have is the powdery mildew. So we see this a lot of times in our cucurbit, our vine crops in the garden throughout the year. Powdery mildew is going to be that white powdery fungus on the top. Downy mildew is going to be that growth on the underside of the leaf, and you can see this burning along the edges. So that's one way to kind of differentiate. But again, always make sure you know which one you have, so you can treat that a little bit more effectively. Pruning is going to be a big issue with grapes. It's kind of cool that grapes actually have tertiary buds. So if they get bit by frost, of course, I mean, that's going to be okay. They'll continue to produce fruit, but they'll just produce less fruit. So kind of keep that in mind. But always removing any of that source of inoculum that you see here. All right, as we move into apples, I've kind of left fruit trees, I guess, toward the end. But again, think about those 5 S's. Really think about cross-pollination requirements. You can't just plant one. Keep that in mind. Rootstocks are going to vary. You can kind of see this here. Hopefully that's a little bit easier to see that all in one chart. But we have a lot of growers that are going with the semi-dwarf just because of that lifespan. You get a little bit more age on that. Of course, your seedling, you see there 30+ years. But a good little amount, 5 to 7 bushels per tree. And pretty, as far as fruit trees go, fairly easy to be able to manage. When we talk about those resistant cultivars, and we'll talk about this like on grafting stock and such. Know kind of what issues you have that's prevalent. If you've been attending my classes, you hear me preach on that all the time, keeping that journal throughout the gardening season. You know, it's a 12-month journal. Keep a record of everything that you have going on. If you have certain fungal pathogens, or like the cedar apple rust, the mildews, any of that in other areas like in your garden with powdery mildew, then you know that you're going to be susceptible to that. So maybe looking at a Liberty variety would be more amenable to what you're trying to do. So again, all these things kind of intertwine themselves, and just always kind of know what kind of pressure you have going on. But you can see there how much more effective that's going to be at being able to control some of these. I can't see the fire blight because I have y'all over here. Yeah, that is fire blight. And I'll show you a picture of this in a few minutes, because this is one, I got multiple questions on the fire blight. So this is something I think a lot of you are battling. As far as pear trees, again, we used to say that these were pretty easy to grow, what I've always called the old-timey pear trees, but we're starting to see fewer and fewer of those. But when we talk about pears, we're going to grow those very similar to apple trees. You'll notice there's that self-pollinating that I said earlier, but many are going to require cross-pollination. Even on self-pollinating, I always would recommend making sure you've got a couple of different kinds. If we do get into an early bloom situation, that's where we get a lot of that loss from an early spring frost. Disease is going to be the biggest threat. Many different kinds that we can grow, but fire blight again is going to be one of those issues. And this is what our fire blight looks like, and it actually looks like the tip of that twig is being burned back, scalded, almost caught on fire. It's just blackened. And I'm going to come back to all of these when we talk about control measures in a few minutes, again, to show you how important it is to right now be thinking about this, because some of these issues we need to be controlling now, or at least setting ourselves up to higher protection standards than waiting till it manifests itself as a major problem. This is apple scab. People can still utilize this fruit. It's just not going to be very marketable. We might not buy that at the grocery store, but you can usually cut that out and still have salvageable fruit. But you're going to see it look like this before this, so you can control that before we get to this stage a little bit. Cedar apple rust, was it 2 years ago, from here to the research center, it's about a 5-mile drive, and you would literally see these just by the hundreds, it seemed like. But these are those little spore pockets that cause the issue. These are grown on cedar trees, but this is what causes an issue in our apple trees. And I should have put a better picture in here, but some of the time or sometimes the entire leaf surface will be just spotted up and covered with this. But that's why we'll say to remove cedar trees, especially if you have some disease susceptibility. So again, making sure you're researching those cultivars and getting some of those sprays on early spring can help reduce some of the occurrence of this later on. And then this is our bitter rot. And again, it almost looks like a target spot. It's going to be caused by some of those same pathogens that we call targets. See, I still do that, y'all. I go back to tobacco sometimes. I digress. I'm sorry. But anyway, so bitter rot, you're going to see here that you will have some permeation of the skin there and into the fruit zone, but you can still utilize some of that fruit, but it's better to just control that to begin with. The biggest thing you can do is just those disease-resistant varieties. Really check into that. Fire blight's going to be really difficult to control chemically, so that resistance is going to be really important there. And again, I think probably 6 or 7 of you had submitted questions about fire blight, so we know that's something really going on. Just like with all the other crops we've talked about, we want to remove any of that inoculum, especially from scab, and we see a high occurrence of this because people will bring in samples thinking that it's cedar apple rust. In reality, it's going to be that scab. But either one, we want to be raking that material out and getting rid of it. Pruning is going to be the #1 practice this time of year. That's going to help us promote that airflow, open up that canopy, and it's going to allow that fungicide, all those cover sprays that we're going to be, applying 13 months out of the year. It's going to allow further fungicide penetration. And again, just removing some of those mummified fruits, any cankers, any of that's going to be really optimal. Peaches. And I will tell you, some of you that I know master gardeners here in the county have heard me say this. This is one that our state work group, we really struggle with peaches, because peaches just don't do very well in in a lot of places in Tennessee. And I don't say that to be negative. I just want you to be cognizant of that fact, because like peaches are one of my favorite fruits, and I would love to be able to grow them, but I know that they just have so much disease pressure, and they're a tropical fruit, which is one reason in Northeast Tennessee they're not going to produce very well. They are tropical in origin. So just make sure that and we know here in Northeast Tennessee that frost is going to be an issue. That's why peaches are so expensive if we do get bit by frost, because there's very few peaches. But we've got successful growers right here in the county that are growing peaches, but it does require an enormous amount of time. Time as far as you applying cover sprays and pruning, but also time into full production. As far as diseases, and a couple of you had asked about these, brown rot's a major issue. You can actually see that fruit is rotting kind of from the outside in, and none of that fruit, unlike some of those diseases with apple, would be able to be utilized, because the peach is so much more fleshy than an apple. And then we have the bacterial spot. So this is not a fungal disease, but this is one that we do see quite frequently, and the peach tree curl, bacterial spot, all of those when these trees first start leafing out. So what can occur when you start seeing some of these issues on your leaves is that we can have fruit drop. So kind of keep that in mind. That's something we want to make sure that we kind of get a hold of. And then also just that defoliation, you can kind of see the color, how much lighter green here it is. When we start losing foliage on the tree, then of course that tree can't make food. I can't photosynthesize. So that's going to lead to stress of the tree, which is going to open that tree up to further disease issues on down the road. We've talked about most of these so far with all the rest of them, but just notice here, avoid varieties that are susceptible to bacterial spot, because a bacterial is a little bit harder for us to control as far as our spray arsenal. But you can see some of those listed, and Alberta is a very popular variety that's grown here, and this is one that we see a lot of pressure with, so just be aware of that. Just some takeaway themes before we get into the end here. Again, resistant varieties, y'all, that's where it's at. Really research those. Arkansas and Missouri both have some really great varieties that are coming out. A lot of those are in trials. We're looking to trial even more of those moving forward. So really look into that for your specific area, your region, whatever kind of disease pressure you have. Make sure to think about those 5 S's. Good drainage and sunlight are going to be critical. Drainage, that's also, it's not just water, but that's also frost drainage as well. Always prune, don't let it go for a year. Some of you on here, I know what I'm talking about there. If you've moved to the area and you bought a home and you've got one of those neglected orchards, it's disheartening to try to be able to revamp that and basically almost starting from scratch. But pruning is actually going to be one of the best cultural practices that you can do for the long-term viability of your trees. And then just removing out any of that dead material. So you'll notice here a takeaway theme, just learning to identify these. We spent a lot of time on those pictures because I didn't want to gom those slides up with a bunch of words, but I'm going to show you where, again, that you can go. That publication I sent you this morning is going to give us those spray schedules for each one of these crops. When we think about organic, do recognize that we do have some that are available, but just make sure that it's labeled for that intended use. Most of the time, those organic products are going to be biological or plant extract based, and so the efficacy on those is not going to be long-term or very substantial. So just be cognizant of that and know that those preventative sprays are going to be really, really important. So here's just a little snapshot of that publication that I've been talking about all night, and I just picked up the apple, cut that out here to show it to you. But you can kind of see here the different materials. And the cool thing about this, the first page or the second page of this publication is going to have all these chemicals listed. It's going to tell you some of the trade names. It's going to have the actual chemical name. It's going to tell you what it's used for and all that. So this is not the only place you're going to see this, but this is getting down to the crop specific. It's going to tell you, right now, dormant oil, maybe even with the addition of copper, and you can see there that's where we're smothering out all those little creepy crawlies that we can't always see, especially the older you get, you have to wear glasses, so aphids, mites, scales, all of that. Or if fire blight has been an issue, and again, I think that's one of the biggest issues we have up here, making that addition of copper. And we do that now. That's going to help lower that occurrence later in the season. I know that seems crazy, but you saw that slide. We don't have a lot of chemical control that we can use for fire blight. So we've got to think about it now. Notice there at bud break, we're going to use Captan, which is a fungicide for scab control, if that's been an issue for you in the past. Notice this chemical here, Immunox. I kind of say that's an immune booster, kind of like these vaccines we've been taking. You get the second shot. That's all. I mean, that's not exactly what Immunox is, but that's kind of what I liken it to, is that it's just enhancing that tree's immune defense system. So if cedar apple rust has been an issue, then Immunox is going to be what you want in your arsenal. And then it's also going to tell you that malathion, that's an insecticide. We can mix some of those, and that's going to be okay. And we're going to be controlling multiple issues at one time. So make sure that you check these out. That's going to be real important. I've already talked about spotted wing a little bit, just acknowledging that we're starting to see a higher occurrence of this in blueberries and strawberries, grapes, and you can actually see it in blackberries. That's another one. That was our first occurrence in Greene County, was with blackberries. But it's actually the larva that you can see there. You can't necessarily see it until that fruit starts to juice up and they kind of start crawling out. It's kind of gross. So sometimes you don't know you have that issue until it's too late to deal with it. But there's also a publication just on spotted wing for your reference. We've already talked about the scale, but these are things that we're controlling now with those dormant oil sprays, doing pruning. All of that's going to help us right now control these. This is I can't ever say this word, I get tongue-tied, plum curculio. And this is one notice, the biggie here is that it's overwintering on the orchard floor. So that's why we say, or you hear me say all the time, build a big fire, burn all this stuff, don't toss it over the fence. Spores are just going to continue to circulate. So burn that material and get all of that out of there. Any of that mummified or dried fruit, remove that as well. Oriental fruit moth, sometimes these are going to be a little bit harder to determine. As a home gardener, you might see this and think fire blight. Sometimes you'll see that oozing sap and you'll automatically, think, well, I might have a moth issue going on here. But again, sending us a sample, that's going to help us be able to figure out what's going on. But you can see the damage pretty extensive from that, as well as the codling moth. This is where we get a lot of injury from each year. But notice here that fruit thinning is going to be one of the biggest issues that you can do. And hopefully you've started to notice that a lot of the things that we're doing to manage our fruit crops is cultural in nature. We don't want to be waiting until there's no point and shoot chemical that's going to give us 100% control. If we're managing these crops throughout the season, then we're going to be a lot more effective. Here's another one. There were several of you that submitted questions on the black knot. And yes, black knot can affect your peach trees. Some people didn't think that it could, but it can. You can see there it affects plum, cherry, and peach. So it's going to spread in the springtime. Those little spores will float around, and you can see the source there is wild or abandoned trees. But when we see this, we want to prune that back And again, you see there, burn or bury the pruning, the clippings. But we don't want to prune right here, right where it's at. We want to take that back because we still have some of that pathogen that can exist within that branch. So make sure to remove all of that. Okay, so we're going to finish up tonight. I did this for Darby a couple of weeks ago, just an early or winter, early spring task list to kind of sum us all up for things we need to be thinking about February, March, and April. So just to kind of hit on these, remember right now is the perfect time to be pruning. We don't want to let this chore slide. This is our #1 cultural practice. This just needs to come first. When we go all the way back to what we started talking about tonight, your philosophy and management style, think about pruning, because that's going to be an ongoing practice. And some of those cool fruits that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the berries last week, all of those always go back to pruning and those cultural methods. And again, if you're unsure if some of that material you're pruning out is diseased or if it's dead, then err on the side of caution and build a bonfire. Caneberries, all those need to be trained and pruned. Even if you're that tier 3 grower we were talking about, that's okay. You can trellis those up against a fence line or a pretty inexpensive trellis system. They don't require an enormous amount of space, but it's so much better if you can get those up and trained. Notice there, those floricane bearing, they're going to need to be required or pruned multiple times throughout the year. If you, this is actually the little schematic that I was talking about for pruning your brambles, your caneberries. Whoops, see there, I did it. And you have 2 slides in here. So just make sure that you know, whoops, I'm going backwards. You should be able to just pull these out of that Google or off the website or out of the Google Drive, so you can kind of see what steps you need to be taken. And there's a little paragraph underneath there that kind of walks you through step by step on each one of these. And then you'll notice there that the primocane harvest, if that's what we're going for, we can mow that planting to the ground in late winter. So even now that can be done, that can be achieved. So that's why a lot of home gardeners like this type, the primocane bearing. Also, just remember your fruit tree. We want to be making those pruning cuts now. You can kind of see from this schematic, we have all that other material in there. Well, imagine when all that leaves out, that really heavy, dense foliage. You know, we're pushing a lot of energy to producing that vegetation rather than the fruit. We want to be producing fruit rather than leaves, right? So that's why that's so important. If you have inherited or purchased one of those farms that's got neglected trees, sometimes this is where we go. We start back at ground zero and just start all over. So this is one of our favorite little slides, especially those of you that know Natalie Bumgarner, just taking the chainsaw and cutting the whole thing down, and then you don't have to worry about it. Do recognize that there's a couple of other types of pruning. The espalier, that's French. I can't say French very well, but that's basically where you're growing that tree up on the side of a barn wall or house wall or something. So there's even those options, and there's a publication in there that shows you how to do that. Again, just to reiterate on the spraying, you can kind of see where we're at there with February, March, and April, kind of hitting on some of these in the next couple of months. If you do apply lime sulfur, which is great, you can do that, but do that before bud break. So we are easing into that time zone. So make sure that if you're applying that you do it before bud break. And I've already showed you this, but again, just refer to these for each crop. If you are grafting fruit trees, and many of us in Extension will hold grafting workshops each year, and we've not been able to do that this year just because of the pandemic, because we usually have a really huge turnout for that. But if you're grafting at home, it's not too late. You just want to make sure that those trees are still dormant. Good sign wood is going to be about a year-old wood. It's going to be wood that grew the previous summer. You're usually going to find that on those outermost limbs or water sprouts from the trunk or the large branches. Now, I'm not real big on using those water sprouts as much because I think they're a little bit more flimsy, but no matter, make sure that you can kind of see here that we've got some predominant buds on that sign would. Make them about pencil width. It's what the size needs to be. You can see here from that picture. If you are storing those in the refrigerator, make sure you don't have anything that's emitting ethylene, like apples, in there with them, because it'll cause those buds to sprout on out. So be really careful with that. And there's also a grafting handout in there for you as well. As we move into March, which again is here next week, that's when we can begin planting fruit trees. Same for grapevines. A lot of our crops can be planted this time of year. Somebody had put in the Google Drive about the cicadas, and I had not even thought about the cicadas, what damage that they can actually do to trees. And Lee would probably be one better to address this, the whole cicada thing. But what I did discover was that they do spend most of their time underground feeding on the roots of trees, and then they develop into those nymphs that we see. And usually after you first start hearing that wang, you know, they're never in key. That drives me crazy. They're pitched so high. But anyway, after about 10 days, you hear the females, that's them laying their eggs, and that's where the damage from these trees actually comes from. So they're ripping into the branches and they're laying their eggs underneath the tree's bark. Oftentimes, this is not a fruit tree. I couldn't find one to show you that, but this is what we'll call flagging. And that's when the outside edges of that tree and those leaves actually start wilting and dying back. And you can kind of see what that looks like there. So when we start seeing those occurrences, flagging, stressing the tree, as she's burrowing, coming out of the ground, burrowing into the bark, laying her eggs, then of course she has created a port of entry, and that can be for secondary invaders, other insects or other pathogens to enter that wound. So that's why they can be so detrimental to trees. I did find a publication from the University of Maryland that's going to be in your Google Drive, but do notice there that their primary hosts are going to be elm, chestnut, ash, maple, and oak. So I guess probably now more maple and oak with some of the other tree issues that we've had going on. But you'll notice this picture down here. If you are planting or do have some vulnerable young trees, you can utilize netting to cover those, or even the, I don't know how you say this word, the tulle or tulle that you use like in weddings, that stuff. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I don't know how better to describe that, but anyway, that might be a little bit of a cheaper option to cover that young tree or bush up to mitigate some of those issues. Insecticides are not going to be very beneficial. They're not very effective. As far as cicadas, I put some post-cicada tips in here, just some ideas on fertilizing, pruning, and then just keeping them watered. We want to reverse the stress cycle if we can at all. So again, there's a handout in there. Very good question. I'm glad you asked that, because like I said, that's something I hadn't even thought about. Again, we're planting, so make sure that soil is prepped before you plant blueberries. This is a blueberry plant. You kind of see how that hole's dug. One thing we always say to incorporate organic matter. Sometimes people will use peat. Whatever that is, don't just put that stuff in the hole. We want to incorporate that, because that fluff is really critical for drainage, again, because of those root hairs of the blueberry plant. But you want that to be mixed up, because otherwise that peat can actually burn those roots. So be careful with that. You can also, planting the caneberries. You can do that bare rooted, tip layering, or tissue cultured. So if you do order those bare root, they should arrive just before you plant, so make sure that you heel those into the ground. Don't let those roots dry out. And make sure that you're purchasing from a reputable source. And that leads to another question. Somebody asked about where we can source all these. So you do have a link in the Google Drive. It's for purchasing fruit all across Tennessee for every type of fruit. And I think there's a few other states listed too, so you'll want to make sure you check that out. And just some pictures there of planting, fertilizing fruit trees. We want to do that about a month after bud break. Same way with blueberries. Now there's a publication, it's a one-pager on fertilizing blueberries depending on what type you have, because remember we got rabbit eye and high bush, depending on what age your blueberry plants are. So refer back to that. It's a handy one-pager just on the chart that'll kind of guide you in that process. But usually we'll do that twice, 6 weeks apart. Word of caution, if we do start to warm up and you've got strawberries, or if you're going to plant strawberries this year, think about this for next year. You'll see folks that will cover with straw. Make sure that it's straw and not hay, because hay will introduce weed seeds. But we want to uncover those as it starts to get warmer. Now you might have to go out there and cover them up a few times if the temperature gets too cool at night, but strawberries can actually withstand a little bit under that 32-degree mark. Wouldn't want to chance it, but just as an FYI, they can. But make sure that you're uncovering these during the hot parts of the day, otherwise we're just gonna mold those plants and they're not going to grow. And then if you're wanting to plant strawberries this year, again, just making sure those plants are disease-free, reputable dealers. Ordering early is good. Bare root plants do remarkably well, but you can purchase plugs, but usually we don't plant those till later in the fall. Make sure when you do plant the roots that you're giving them enough room to fan out. And you'll notice there, really pay attention to this picture, because this is where a lot of our home gardeners mess up planting strawberries, because it's either too deep or too shallow for that crown to sit in the soil. So getting that crown level with the soil is going to be the best thing to do. And notice how the roots in this last picture kind of sway to the side. We don't want that. We want to encourage those roots to go down deep. And you'll notice there double rows are used, or you can stagger those plantings in one row, and that gives a little bit more creep and crawl for the runners. And don't forget to water. And again, you've already seen that picture. And just some fertility issues for strawberries. But now, as we're moving into the season, if you're using any kind of irrigation system, going ahead and getting that in place now is going to be really time saving as we do start moving toward put things in our garden, which some of you may already be doing that, but now's the time to prep and ready for all of that stuff. Fertilizing blackberries once those primocanes emerge, and then you're going to wait until after harvest to fertilize again. Again, if you've got wild brambles, probably need to remove those just to reduce some of the disease pressure. Any of our stone fruits like the peaches and the plums, nectarines, apricots, apply those in 2 halves now and later. It just kind of depends on the frost situation, but I'll usually send out a reminder about those things via email. And then fertilizing grapes. We want to do that pre-plant if we can. In subsequent years, you fertilize now in late winter. So again, there's a handout in there just on grapes, because again, it's going to depend on what type you're growing. As we do build that arsenal, especially if we've got fruit trees, we're thinking about putting all these sprays and elements and all the, on throughout the year. So as you're building that arsenal, just remember to spray ethically. Think about our pollinators, really read the label, keep all that stuff intact with your chemicals, know what you're applying, how much and when, and really adhere to that for environmental, pet, and your own protection. If you're utilizing mulches, that is an excellent cultural practice for fruit and veggies, landscape, whatever. It's going to help increase survival and growth. We're going to maintain more uniform moisture levels in that root zone. It's going to reduce any of those temperature fluctuations that we typically have early spring, and then of course again in late summer into early fall. But oftentimes we've seen it multiple times in data that mulch is going to help us reduce weeds and increase our yields. So this is actually out at the research center mulching the blueberries. We got creative. We used the manure spreader to do that. But if you want any details on that, just call me and I'll tell you how we did that. As we move into May, just remember that it starts to get hot, so we want to try to have a lot of those cultural practices that we've been talking about, you know, finished and complete, because as we start warming up, a lot of our fruit crops, they can withstand the heat. Some are going to be more tolerant of drought, but still yet some of those are going to be a little bit stressed, and a lot of that's going to depend on Mother Nature. But as we move into May, if you've not got any of those fruit crops planted, wait until it cools off, or get your ground ready, prepare all that soil, and then come back and do it next year, especially for blueberries, y'all. I cannot emphasize that enough. I know I'm harping on that, but I've seen too many people fail because they want to grow blueberries and they just go out there and plant the bushes, and they don't do that soil test. They don't amend the soil. If you do that right first, you won't be playing catch up, I promise. And then it's just all about enjoying spring, y'all. It's right around the corner. So that's kind of where we're at tonight. I hope that I addressed a lot of those questions. And like I say, hang on a minute, where'd y'all go? There we go. If you have had further questions come up tonight, I hope that you will put those in that, or submit those via the Google form, or I see we've got like 78 Q&A in the chat, so I don't know if Jenny's been answering those or what, but I'll check into that and we'll get those answered tonight and get that sent out to you. So you'll get a pretty lengthy email with all these links. Make sure you go and check out the new website. If you've not registered for March, again, we're focusing on sustainable landscape, so we've got a lot of good material coming your way. And April, we're going to devote to vegetable gardening, so it's going to get fun, y'all. We're warming up. Spring is in the air. Okay, thanks, you guys. We'll see you next Monday.